History. Lesson 8, Chapter 17, Africa on its own, Ethnic Conflict, Autocracy, and Underdevelopment. This lesson examines developments on the continent of Africa after the end of the Cold War. One of the major trends was increased involvement and intervention into the affairs of many African countries by international organizations such as the United Nations, particularly since areas of Africa were no longer pawns in the Cold War chess game. During the Cold War, the superpowers had invested economic and military aid to countries who were their client states or on their side during the Cold War rivalry. Predictably, when the Cold War ended and the strategic importance of the regions lost their immediate Cold War importance, the former recipient states faced immediate challenges as the money ceased coming in. Both Washington and Moscow had a checkered track record in supporting repressive governments in Africa and other areas of the globe, like Latin America. The text points to the case of Ethiopia, in which a despotic regime of 14 years was overthrown from within and led to chaos. One of the chronic challenges facing many African countries was the internal division based upon so many different ethnic groups living together in one state. In the past, in colonial times, those divisions could be kept in check by the power and authority of the colonial government. But upon independence, these ethnic tensions often flared. Similarly, the internal divisions could often be managed during dictatorships. Authoritarian leaders could keep order by repression and state violence. In the example of Ethiopia, one result of the instability resulting after the overthrow of a despot was a breakup of the country, as the province of Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia in 1993. In Somalia, internal instability was prompted not by ethnic or religion, but by clans and subclans, and the result was a degeneration into violence between the private armies of clans, resulting in the death in 1992 of 400,000 Somalis due to disease, starvation, and violence. This desperate situation prompted an international response by the international community and a peacekeeping force. While the force was successful in reducing violence and opening up supply routes, with the end of the UN peacekeeping force's mandate in 1995, the violence and faction fighting simply resumed. The case of Rwanda was the most tragic, with the violence between Tutsi and Hutu peoples. One of the major issues was the fact that though the Hutu people formed the majority of the population, it was the Tutsi people who were the ruling elite. During the spring and summer of 1994, Hutus massacred at least 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in what must be called a genocide. Nigeria held out hope as a modern African nation. It is West Africa's wealthiest and most powerful country, with a large share of the continent's population. Its money mostly comes from its large oil reserves, which held promise for economic development. However, even Nigeria was beset by internal ethnic tensions, which threatened to destabilize it. In addition to this is the country's lack of democratic traditions since its independence from Britain in the 1960s, as there has been one military dictatorship after another. On the other hand, Nigeria has emerged as a peacekeeping force in the region, ready to intervene in neighboring conflicts. Effective rule by civilian government with democratic institutions has been one of the great challenges for African nations since the wave of independence in the 1960s. On the one hand, African states don't have the long-standing democratic traditions like Europe has had. Not having a tradition and history of functioning democracy has been a challenge. Particularly during times of crisis and economic instability, the ineffectual democratic institutions often succumb to strongmen and military dictators. Another element which has helped create the political and economic instability throughout much of Africa has been the legacy of colonialism. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a scramble for Africa in which European nations, such as Britain and France, among others, raced to claim and secure African territories as quickly as possible. The result were colonies, and later independent states, which were artificial creations, pulling together sometimes hundreds of different ethnic groups, often of differing religions, and many of whom were historic rivals, if not enemies. This basic fact of so many African nations has been a challenge that has proved extremely difficult to overcome. One of the prominent success stories in terms of democratization and power sharing has been the Republic of South Africa. In essence, this was to overcome the institutional racism of the apartheid system, in which the majority black African peoples were subjected by the minority white Africans, descendants of British and Dutch colonial populations. South Africa had become a pariah state in the eyes of the international community during the 1980s, and remained so until the government of F.W. de Klerk began to dismantle the apartheid state in 1989. In 1990, the African National Congress, or ANC, was legalized, and the iconic ANC deputy leader, Nelson Mandela, was finally released from prison after spending 27 years as a political prisoner. In North Africa, one of the important developments was the spread of Islamic violence, which threatened the stability of the region. As a general trend, many were drawn to the radical Islamist movement because of the poor circumstances in many nations, as young people faced bleak futures of poverty and little hope of a better future. Many of the Islamic movements offered answers to people's frustration and disappointment by blaming corrupt ruling elites, often in secular governments, deeming them to be Western-created, decadent, and immoral regimes who did not care about their peoples. Here, the text examines the case of Algeria. Assessing the state of Africa after the Cold War points to a mixed blessing. On the one hand, many African nations were no longer pawns to be controlled by the superpowers for the strategic advantage of the USA or the USSR. African states would be able to chart their own destinies. On the other hand, this also meant less attention, loans, and investment, as nations and private banks sought to invest in areas such as Latin America and East Asia, which appeared more stable and more promising as an investment.